Welcome back to Recycled and Saved. We haven't parted a lot of bikes lately, but I felt I should get a video out there. I had a couple of discussions recently with guys who were looking for their first commuter bike to get around town, get to work, grocery getter, that kind of thing. I gotta say the Suzuki DRZ400 is the bike to have for just this kind of thing. The cool thing about the well, before I get into that, if you've ridden like off-road bikes or had experience with bikes and ridden motorcycles and you're comfortable with it, the DRZ400 is the bike to have. If you haven't, then it probably makes more sense to start with like a DR200 or a TTR225 or an XR250 or KLX250, one of those kind of bikes. It's definitely true. You look at the small bikes to start with, and Dirt Rider does a nice comparative shootout of them. If you've got more bike than you can handle and you're scared of it, you're not going to learn to ride comfortably and safely. If you've got a bike that you can easily override, you're going to get a lot more comfort and feel for riding, less fear of the bike, and be a much better rider much more quickly. So if this is your first foray into motorcycles, start with the smaller 200 or 225. But if you've been riding and you're ready, especially if you've got dirt bike experience, the DRZ400 is the bike to have. It's a great commuter bike if the speeds are reasonably low. If you've got to jump on the interstate at all, get yourself an actual street bike. If you've got to go on a divided highway, in the 50 to 70 mile an hour range for more than a couple miles on a daily basis, that's not going to be so fun either. The thing's going to be wide open and your teeth are going to be rattling. But if it's where you're getting across town, you've got to go to the grocery store, you've got to go to work or school, and you're really not going over 50, 60 miles an hour, it's the bike to have. On that line, knobby tires are nice if you're going off-road at all, but knobby tires will leave you on the ground if you're pushing any kind of weight onto them on the pavement, and that's where the whole DRZ SM comes in. They've got the DRZ Model S, which is the dual sport model with the taller rims and knobby tires, and then they've got the SM, which is Supermoto, and that they came out with in 2005. Much more stable on the road, but the front wheel is completely useless on any kind of gravel, or if it's not treaded well, even in the rain. So every bike's a compromise, but the best bike to ride always is the one you're on. But if you look, the DRZ, Wikipedia has got out here, it's been around since 2000, and in the US it didn't ever get the kickstart. You got the E off-road only, so it didn't have lights, the S, which is the street legal Supermoto, and the the street legal dual sport, and the SM, which is a Supermoto. Started that in 2005. They did some changes to the plastics and cosmetics in 2007. So if you look and you're trying to find out which parts swap, pretty much anything mechanical from 2000 to 2022 is the same, except for when you're going with the Supermoto version, you're going to end up with the upside down front forks, which are incredible, and the bigger brake rotors and the wider rims and the swing arm that they stole off the RM250 to have a wider swing arm. But otherwise, everything else on these bikes is the same. So great commuter bike. Make sure that you check it out, and if you do go to buy a used one rather than new, let somebody else take the shine off, drop it a few times, and save yourself a couple of grand. Just know who you're buying from. If they kept the air filter clean and kept the oil changed, it's a non-issue. And obviously, I'm not sure who I'm talking to here, but if it's a motorcycle, you want to get good synthetic oil because the clutch basket runs in the motor oil. With a multi-disc clutch, you break down the viscosity. As far as what to deal with on a DRZ, there's a lot of stuff out there on different forums, S versus SM, And in reality, what I think it comes down to is the S forks suck. Real soft and mushy. So if you're on the pavement at all and you're good at using the front brake and you grab a handful of front brake, it's going to almost throw you over the handlebars. So if you keep the S forks, you're going to have to put spacers on the springs to stiffen up the forks, or you can either buy the triple clamp and forks for the SM, but then you've got to get the SM wheels, or go with some kind of RM or RMZ fork. There's a lot of stuff on different forums on how to upgrade those forks from the S to the SM standard and make that work. There's some different stuff out there comparing it to other bikes like the XR400 or the newer Honda CRF450L. This bike's just been around for 2 decades. Everything's been bulletproof, proven. It's the bike to have, the bike to get. When you are shopping for a used bike, obviously ignore the plastics. Anybody can put new plastics on a bike and tell you it was their girlfriend's bike, even if they rinsed it out and used it up completely. See if the foot pegs are good and tight. Look at the bottom of the frame, see how beat up it is. Wiggle the rear wheel and see how tight and solid the linkage is. One thing I do definitely with the DRZs as much as any bike, probably more so than any bike, is check the VIN number. If you go and check the VIN number, let me get here where I can see the actual where to spot the VIN. The VIN on a DRZ is up on the triple clamp, and you can see the VIN number on there. And then just Google the darn VIN. If you put a VIN number in Google and search it, it can come up, and it might take you to one of the VIN things, but more importantly, it'll tell you. You know how often this happens with motocross bikes more than street bikes, because the street bike should have a title, but somebody tells me that they're selling me a 2004, and I Google the title, and it's a 2002 or a 2003. Sometimes it's a 2008, but more often than not, it's older than what they thought it was. And with the DRZ, it's easier to swap that around because the bike's been identical for all those years. The biggest thing with the DRZ, Googling the title, is finding out if you think you're buying an SM and you're actually getting an S that somebody modded the suspension on. It's worth knowing that. There are a couple of sites that, in addition to checking the VIN and Googling it, you can go to these spots where you can go to, like Cyclopedia has this really nice VIN decoder. You put the VIN in, you search it, and it tells you not only the VIN for the bike you're looking at, but it tells you the sequential code, what each digits mean. Anytime you buy a Suzuki, it's always going to be JS1. Every manufacturer has their brand name and where it was built, which country, which plant. And then there's the vehicle, the check digit, the model year, which plant it was built in, and then the 6 digits that are unique for that model so that they can build, up to 999,999 of them, a million vehicles on that VIN code. So it's kind of a neat site to just check. So if you're buying anything, you can use this for ATVs, jet skis. First Google the VIN, but put it in the Cyclopedia and see what you get. It's a good spot to find out and make sure that if somebody's selling you a 2014 DRZ400 SM, you can find out and make sure it's not really a 2005 DRZ-S that was modified and changed to that. So not to spend the whole video talking about VIN number checks, but it's definitely worth looking at and doing that. Next thing I wanted to talk about is what are issues that you might consider if you buy a DRZ. Anytime you buy something, you're really buying work. Make sure that you know who you're buying from, that they've actually had it for a chunk of time, that you're not just buying it from some flipper who bought some beat up junk bike and put new plastics and seat on it, and now they're trying to get your money. Make sure you understand where it came from. The title should show how long they've owned it. Check around, like I said, make sure that when you wiggle the foot pegs in the suspension, you'll get a sense of how tight the bike is. Look at the triple clamp stops and see how banged up they are, or if the paint is still on them. That'll tell you how much that bike's been clicked around and used and bashed up a little bit. If you do decide to get the DRZ and you're going to use it for commuting and beating around, it sure would be nice to be able to get a carrier for them, but nobody really makes a nice carrier. One thing I would emphasize is right here. When I buy a bike, I always ask, what else have you got in the garage? If somebody put on aftermarket lights and exhaust, it's great that you got that Yosh exhaust until you get pulled over for speeding and he says, I'm gonna let you go on the speeding, but you got to get the noise fixed. Here's your ticket. You got 30 days or we take your plate. In a lot of states, that's the way they do it. You damn well better have that stock exhaust to put on and get it checked out and approved with the cops, and then put your modified exhaust back on. If you don't have this stock pipe, the number of times I've gotten this stock pipe with a used bike and sold it on eBay because somebody needed it to go pass a noise test. So when you're buying a bike, make sure you ask, what parts do you have in the basement, the garage, or the attic? I want them. Same thing if you get a cop that really wants to jerk you around on the LED tail light or signal light reducers you've got. You might have to put the stock unit back on, go get it approved, get it checked out, and go through that. So when you buy a used bike, always ask, do you have all this other stuff? What can I get? The other one that comes along with that is a lot of times guys will put on modified, in addition to exhaust, they might have different saddle bags or tank bags, and if you ask for it when you're haggling, you'll get it. If you don't, you won't. This bike had this nice aftermarket oversized fuel tank, but the stocker I wouldn't have got if I didn't ask for it, but I got the stock fuel tank, which was great. So make sure you ask for that stuff. Get that done. I don't want to beat that too hard. But again, make sure that the bike looks clean, feels clean, and there's some spots that the guys that put new plastics on typically don't check, like how wiggly are the foot pegs. Check the stops on the triple clamp and see how beat up that is. Check the ends on the handlebars. Even if they got new grips on, you should be able to tell if they've been ground to an angle underneath because it was sliding across the pavement. Check how decent the tires are, that kind of thing. Once you've got a DRZ, and whenever I go to look at a bike, I always tell them, when I get there, if it's not cold, we're going to have to hang around until it cools off because I don't want to have a warmed up, ready to go bike. I want a cold bike to check. On these newer 4-stroke liquid cooled bikes, you've got to set the valve lash every once in a while, especially if you got somebody that's revving the heck out of it or if you didn't take good care of it. And with these electric start bikes, if you've got off valve lash, you got to crank it over really fast, or the valves have to be warmed up, or you're going to have too much blow-by and it's not going to start. So a lot of guys think DRZs are really cold-blooded and they don't start unless they're warm. Well, what it is the valves aren't seating well, and the electric start doesn't crank the motor fast enough, and since you can't kick it, you just got to crank and crank until the thing warms up a little bit. So make sure you've got, after you buy it, make sure you got a good, clean, decent air filter. Make sure you run synthetic oil. Make sure you got decent tires. Make sure you got decent brake pads. You can just take the wheels out and clean the brake pads off with a wire brush, and it'll make a big difference. Check the valve lash, then look at stuff you can buy. Don't go buy an aftermarket exhaust until you go through this stuff. The DRZ has a pretty tall seat height. I'm 5'10", and it's a little bit tall, so if you're less than that, you're going to have to struggle a little bit if you can get a lower seat height. If you're taller than that, you might want to get a softer traveling seat for it. You might want to get different taller bars that suit you, not to be stylish. You don't need big fat bars with bigger clamps, but get bars that are comfortable with you. I don't see a lot of use for performance stuff on DRZs. The one that I do know from DRZs I've bought, every one of these on this list here I've bought and I've parted and we've used around the shop for a while until I got rid of them, is the Electron carb. If you can get a hold of a used Electron carb off of eBay, or if you can go ahead and buy a new one if your carb is junk, that does seem to improve the performance pretty greatly on a DRZ, more than anything else I've messed with. Exhaust silencers and stuff like that, maybe not, but this is the one. If you really think you're going to be about getting performance out of it, that's the one feature that I've seen added that does seem to make sense. When I go back and look at test riding, I talked about looking it over, but when you go on a test ride with a bike, make sure you run it through all the gears and feel how tight does that shifting drum feel in the transmission. Run it where you're shifting under no load to feel if it's sloppy, and run it where you're shifting and slamming it hard and getting on it to see if it pops back out of gear, especially going from first to second. If it's popping out of gear, then you got a sloppy transmission or sloppy forks or something. But just make sure you get out, run it through the gears. The most likely problem you're going to have with this bike, if you do have a mechanical issue, is transmission, because somebody just hammered the heck out of the thing. And you'll be able to tell that on a test ride, as far as, does this shift positively and tightly, or is this thing been ridden hard and put away wet so many times that it's just used up and it's not the bike for you. But beyond that, the DRZ, I think, is the bike to have if you're going to go buy just a commuter bike to have around. Again, I've parted a lot of them over the years. Good, easy bike to work on. Make sure that if you're not comfortable doing that valve lash setting, if the thing isn't starting cold well, have somebody else do that. Don't start screwing around with the carb or thinking it's something else. I can't prove it, but I bet 90% of the time it's the valve lash needs to be checked. And then think about the kind of riding you're going to do to decide if you want the S or the SM and what kind of tires you want to put on it. Obviously, if you're never going off the pavement, street tires are great. And if you're going to be going at higher speeds in a more of an urban type setting, 35, 45 miles an hour, that's the way to go. But if you live on a dirt road, well, then you better get some dual sport tires. But I will warn you, that dual sport front wheel, those knobbies squirm and crawl, and if you're putting weight on that front wheel like you think it's some kind of a street bike, you're going to end up slamming your face into the pavement at some point soon. Brakes are really great. It's the same brake calipers on here that they put on the RMs at the time, in the early 2000s. So the brakes have good feel and they work well, but just be careful with it. That's all I got. Again, good bike. Make sure you ask for those extra parts. If you're buying your first basic commuter bike and you don't have to go over 50 miles an hour a lot, DRZ400, the bike to buy. If anybody's watching this and thinks I've missed something or had something wrong, definitely put it in the comments. Just trying to help other people get out there, get a fun bike. Life's too short to not have fun, and a cheap way to commute. Thanks. Subscribe.